And before this video begins, I'd just like to give a special thank you to my Asban Team level patron, Fallon Cortez. Thank you for supporting the channel. In 2021, the landscape of Doctor Who changed forever, with the huge announcement that former showrunner Russell "The" Davies would be returning to once again take charge of the iconic show. It was a time of excitement and optimism, especially considering the divisive and polarising atmosphere that came as a result of the 13th Doctor era. People were naturally really excited for the return of such a celebrated and accomplished Doctor Who showrunner, one who had created beloved characters like the 10th Doctor, Rose, Donna and many others, along with writing some of the best stories of the entire modern show. After a brief trilogy of well-received specials bringing David Tennant back, it was finally time for the main event, Series 14, which introduced the 15th Doctor, his companion Ruby Sunday, and promised a return to form with a soft reboot and more fantastical approach. But now that Series 14 is over and the dust is settling, did it work? Was Series 14, or Season 1, a successful return for Russell T Davies and Doctor Who as a whole? Or was it actually a bit disappointing and missed the mark? Well, as always, that's what I'm here to find out. If you want my in-depth thoughts on each episode, be sure to check out my individual reviews, but now, without any further ado, it's time to dive into Doctor Who Series 14. And yes, I refuse to call it Season 1. I think the obvious place to start would be the marketing, especially because it was one of the main criticisms of the previous era of Doctor Who, which felt extremely under-advertised and outside the public consciousness. I mean, part of the advertising campaign for Series 13 was just deleting all social media for no reason, which is basically anti-marketing when you think about it. However, I think Series 14 was very prominent with its marketing, making sure to advertise its presence wherever and however it could. We had a Doctor Who train, the TARDIS was in Disneyland, there was a big premiere for the opening episodes, and lots of trailers, including a very successful one for Disney+. And it all seems to have been a success, domestically at least. I know a lot of people argue back and forth about ratings because the upfront viewership number is lower than it used to be, but when you look at the actual important information like audience share and chart placement, Series 14 was really successful, with 73 yards to the peak thanks to a chart placement of 12th for the week and an audience share of 38.5%, which are very strong numbers. So marketing was clearly successful and the series held a consistent audience throughout. However, I'm still not a fan of the whole midnight release strategy. It clearly seems to have worked to an extent, but I still think it fractures the fanbase experience by staggering everyone's first watch and taking away from that sense of community. Also, I mean, just come on, it just feels weird to watch Doctor Who at midnight, just nah. The other big marketing of Series 14 was its rebrand as Season 1, not to be confused with 2005 Series 1 or 1963 Season 1. Yeah, it's a mess. I've never been a fan of this change. It's obviously heavily influenced by the Disney Plus streaming deal since HBO Max still carries the rest of New Who, so Disney wouldn't want to be putting out something that starts with Series 14 and potentially puts off a lot of newcomers. But I still feel like it's such a misstep, especially because the actual contents of the series don't match up with that idea of softly rebooting or relaunching the show like Davies had previously done in 2005. It relies heavily on audience familiarity with certain concepts, and in the places it doesn't, it has to fill in a lot of exposition in a short span of time, which can make things very clunky. It definitely doesn't feel as slick as its introductions in Series 1 did, and that's partially due to the episode count, but I'll get to that later. I think it's a mixed bag in terms of the success of such a soft relaunch for the show. In a lot of the ways, it does feel like a very clean slate, which is great, a fresh start for everything to be built back up again. Even the Doctor is treated like a new start, the giggle creating a continuity break between the 14th and 15th Doctors with no post-regeneration shenanigans. But the series still relies on a lot of characters and concepts introduced at the end of 2023 with those specials. Disney Plus did apparently try to re-level Church and Ruby Road as the real first episode of the series, but it really does feel like the whole rebrand element wasn't a deliberate narrative choice and instead just something they had to try and work around considering that Disney Plus deal. New or casual fans aren't stupid, they aren't completely lost when like Sutek shows up at the end, but stuff like Susan and the Toymaker are a bit much to throw out there in the first series of a soft reboot. So no, I don't really think it works when you view it as the first true series of a show, whether that's a soft reboot or otherwise, because it still retains a strong link to what came before, for better or for worse. Okay, so let's talk about the Doctor, with Ncuti Gatwa taking on the mantle as the 15th incarnation of the beloved character. Well, not the actual 15th, considering there's the Fugitive Doctor, the War Doctor, the Schalke Doctor. Oh, okay, there's a lot, but I digress. As the incumbent Doctor, Gatwa does an incredible job in Series 14. His incarnation of the character is a very light and carefree one, free of the trauma of his predecessors. The 15th Doctor is very much one of those Doctors who enjoys and appreciates the beauty of life whilst he travels throughout the universe, seeing all sorts of wonders and having such adventures. He's a very happy and jokey incarnation in that sense, with quick wit and generally just having a really great time with things. It's really fun to watch him swagger around and make sassy remarks. He's also quite a flirty Doctor, very camp and charming. However, despite 15 being such a refreshingly optimistic and excitable extroverted character, he still has that darkness and grit Davis loves to add into the Doctor. He has a lot of moments of anger, ranging from his quiet hatred for the system in Boom, to his shocked fury at the short-sighted, racist denizens of Fine Time in Dot and Bubble. So Gatwa does a fantastic job at balancing both core components of the Doctor. However, 15 is also a very emotionally vulnerable and open incarnation, with almost every episode seeing him cry. Now don't get me wrong, this isn't inherently a bad thing. First of all, we saw like the 10th Doctor cry all the time, so it's nothing new, and I think it's actually a positive thing to show male heroes can be emotionally open and vulnerable too. However, I think Series 14 relies on 15's tears a bit much to create a sense of emotion when it doesn't necessarily feel earned on a narrative level. There's moments like Rogue where they use the Doctor's tears to try and force a sense of emotion, but it instead ends up feeling forced. The issue is made worse by them having him cry in almost every episode, so it ends up feeling a bit repetitive and again damages the power of him crying, even if each individual instance is deserved, because they just do it too much and it ends up having diminishing returns on a storyline level. The other big new presence in the series is Ruby Sunday, the companion introduced in the Christmas special as a walking mystery box with unknown origins. We'll get to that in a bit. Much like Gatwa, I think Millie Gibson does incredibly well with the fairly spotty material she was given. Ruby is a very sweet and enjoyable character, matching the 15th Doctor's sense of wonder and joy. Ruby works well as a bit of a mix of all the modern companions, taking traits from each of them, and she's good at all the main aspects of such a character. She does the asking questions well, she has moments of wit and snark, she takes matters into her own hands as a heroic figure, and she also has dramatically heavy moments, especially in 73 Yards, which Gibson very much carries with her performance. However, I did feel like I wanted a bit more from Ruby as a character. It very much feels like there were elements missing, whether that be due to the writing or the short episode count. We never really got the feeling of why she wanted to travel with the Doctor. We don't know whether she even has a job or what home life is like outside of a very small glimpse in Church on Ruby Road. I really can't put my finger on what exactly Ruby is missing to really make her stand out, but it definitely has a significant effect on the character. I do like Ruby, I really do, but I think that's mainly because of Millie Gibson's great portrayal of the character, because the actual writing of Ruby very much lacks the it factor my favourite companions have, and that's a huge shame because I want to love her so much more as a character. But it feels like we knew more about other companions and had a connection with them far sooner than we do with Ruby. However, that being said, the 15th Doctor and Ruby are one of my favourite Doctor companion duos, especially compared to the very weak main teams we had during the 13th Doctor era. Gatwa and Gibson combined brilliantly to form a strong, cohesive, friendly unit. These two best friends flying into wonder and adventure with a laugh and a joke. They're extremely enjoyable to watch in that regard, their characters feel like a natural fit. That's also my biggest issue with the pair. They almost get along too well, so there's no feeling of drama or them clashing like previous pairings did. The Doctor and Ruby became friends instantly, so there's no feeling of their bond growing deeper over their travels or them having the occasional clash over morals or arguing over dilemmas, which is necessary for good narrative drama. I mean, just look at every previous companion that at least had a moment of questioning what they're doing or who the Doctor might be or anything like that. Therefore, 15 and Ruby end up coming across a little bit one note and underdeveloped a lot of times during the series. Very often it feels like they're just there, especially at the end of episodes where they have almost no direct influence on the outcome of the story. They rarely actually beat a monster themselves, and it makes them sometimes feel like passengers as a result. I think the series heavily suffered from Gatwa's filming commitments to sex education, because out of 8 episodes, we have 2 Dr. Light stories, limiting our exposure to both his incarnation and his relationship with Ruby, shrinking an already small amount of character exploration down even further. So it definitely feels like the writing and scheduling of the series weighed down what should be a really fun, engaging and youthful TARDIS duo. I think another big issue with Ruby's writing especially is how her character is almost exclusively defined by her mystery box background, which serves as the main story arc of the series. Church on Ruby Road introduced us to Ruby as a child, abandoned on the steps of the titular church back in 2004. Ruby's main driving force as a character is her desire to discover who her birth mother is and why she was left, with this theme of abandonment running throughout the series. Ruby's desire for answers does give us some great character moments, like in Boom as she lays dying, but the ultimate reveal of her mother being completely normal falls flat. Not because I wanted it to be something special, I love that it's a normal, boring answer that carries a lot of symbolic weight, but instead because the series purposefully deceives you into believing the only answer could be that it's someone special. In Space Babies, there's a big ominous scene of the mother suddenly pointing to the Doctor, his memory having changed. Then there's the snow constantly appearing, and in Devil's Chord the maestro is straight up scared of Ruby, considering her to be something wrong and having a song hidden inside of her. Even the Church on Ruby Road goes out of its way to say how impossible it is to trace a single relative of Ruby. So as you go throughout the series, it feels like it's giving you these hints for a reason, especially in Legend of Ruby Sunday when they physically cannot see under the woman's hood and the Doctor is confused by her ability to almost hide. So for all of these hints and breadcrumbs to be thrown away right at the end feels a little bit insulting, honestly, especially when the big reveal of the mother pointing is that she was actually pointing at a sign that was never there to begin with. She wasn't pointing at the Doctor or the TARDIS or Sutekh, it was just a random sign for literally no reason. It's a horribly disappointing payoff that completely undermines the Ray Nobody story Davis wanted to tell properly with Ruby. It just sabotages itself for social media engagement and outright acts as though the audience was silly for making such outlandish predictions when it had previously encouraged those to begin with. Okay, so the Ruby Road storyline is a bit of a wet fart at the end, but what about the other big storyline of the mysterious Susan Twist? Indeed, starting with Wild Blue Yonder, we began to see the recurring appearances of actor Susan Twist playing completely different side characters in every episode of Series 14. It was a really intriguing mystery, especially when it went from a weird coincidence in Church on Ruby Road to an outright arc as she continued to appear. She ended up a pretty nice Easter egg to look out for each week, and you have no idea what the endgame is. It then eventually turns out that Sutekh latched onto the TARDIS back in Pyramids of Mars and created a Susan Twist everywhere the Doctor landed, so that when he enacted his grand plan, she'd be activated like a sleeper agent and destroy all those times and places simultaneously. It's a pretty nice idea on paper and works well, explaining all those appearances, but I do think they went a little too extreme with it. Like I mentioned in my review, it ends up the same issue as the Clara Echoes faced, when they were supposedly always showing up, but we never actually get to see them because the writer hadn't come along and invented them yet. It just feels a little silly for there to be 40 years worth of stories without a trace of Susan Twist until she suddenly starts showing up out of nowhere because, you know, she wasn't invented yet. I still maintain that it would have been better for Sutekh to latch onto the TARDIS in Flux or Wild Blue Yonder and begin his scheme from there, because as it stands, it's just far too long of a time span to actually work narratively, and it's just led to more memes than anything else. It didn't have the big dramatic bombshell effect Davis intended it to have. Speaking of Sutekh, let's briefly look at the monsters of the series. And unfortunately, it's not a great offering this time around. The series once again falls into the ever so common trap of creating one-off monsters like the Bogeyman, the Ambulances, and the Man-Traps. Fucking hell. Spider. The series once again falls into that common trap of creating one-off monsters like the Bogeyman, the Ambulances, and the Man-Traps, which are all just single-use monsters that physically cannot exist outside of their own narratives. The closest thing to proper classic Doctor Who monsters are the Maestro and the Birds from Rogue, which feel like they could return, although only the latter could feel like it's narratively suitable or justified. There's really not much to say about the monsters and villains of the series. They all feel a little disappointing and underbaked. None of them really leave a mark like so many other monsters in the past, or even Series 1 previously, which reintroduced the Autons and the Daleks, along with creating memorable villains like Cassandra, the Slovene, the Reapers, and of course, the Empty Child. And yes, I know the Empty Child is also a one-off monster, but my god, was that memorable and it was terrifying. Nothing in this series comes close to any of these monsters. Not even Sutek, the big ultimate villain with infinite power, feels like a defined or well-realised threat. He has his big reveal, and then just sits there talking until he's put on a lead and yeeted off into the time vortex to die. It's really unsatisfactory, and I really do wish they'd written the monsters and villains a lot better, because they end up being incredibly bland and forgettable otherwise. The monsters and villains of Doctor Who are one of the show's biggest strengths, and they're parts of its main appeal, so they really dropped the ball this time around, and I can't just overlook that, I'm afraid. I think one of the biggest issues in Series 14 is the lack of satisfying endings. This has been a problem with Doctor Who for quite a while now. It was really bad during the Chibnall era, but it's still just as prevalent in this series, as almost every episode has an ending that just doesn't feel right, with the exception of Dot and Bubble, which has an incredible ending elevating the entire thing, possibly because it's a truly standalone self-contained episode. Endings to stories like Space Babies feel rushed and poorly thought out, and even Boom, possibly the best episode of the entire series, has a power of love ending that really throws things off as a viewer. More often than not, a Doctor Who episode is either made or broken by its ending. Just look at instances like Power of Three, which is a pretty decent episode that completely falls apart at the end and has a very negative reception as a result. Whilst there's nothing quite as dramatic as that in Series 14, episodes like Devil's Cord have really deflating anticlimaxes. Even 73 Yards, another one of those best episodes, has a very weak ending in my opinion, which holds it back from being an all-time great episode, and that's a huge shame. Russell T Davies has always struggled with delivering satisfying endings. It was an issue present throughout his first stint as showrunner, and it's just as bad, if not worse, in his second, as proven with the 60th anniversary specials and now Series 14 afterwards. So many of the episodes feel like they could have been better if they'd just had enough time to craft a more suitable and gratifying ending to resolve things neatly and climactically, or maybe they could have just taken more drafts in the script writing process. Indeed, Series 14 struggles immensely with its time limitations. Despite it being the norm for 12 years under Davis and Moffat, 45 minutes has never felt shorter than it does in Series 14. 73 Yards is a prime example of that, needing even just 5 more minutes to flesh things out a little bit more and deliver some more information about what's going on in such an abstract and surreal episode. The issues with the endings largely stem from this enforced 45-minute runtime, forcing them to all end with this arbitrary time limit rather than just allowing the episodes to live and breathe on their own terms. It's weird to go back to 45 minutes after the Chibnall era had a standard running time of 50, and that still struggled with endings. So it feels like the Series 14 episodes either needed to be given a more flexible runtime to suitably explore their plots and wrap things up, or just be better written or edited on a writing level to fit within the runtime imposed upon them. Because as it stands, every episode feels like it needed more time, and even the series as a whole feels too short. With only 8 episodes, Series 14 is the second shortest series in the entire modern era of Doctor Who. However, it doesn't try to tell a serialized story like Flux did. Instead, Series 14 tries to be traditional Doctor Who without the episode count really needed to make it breathe. After a rocky start, things really started to pick up with Boom, 73 Yards and Dot and Bubble, but then you're over halfway through the series already and it feels like it ends just as it was getting good. I know we're well past the days of a 13 episode series with loads of two-parters, but Series 14 really does feel far too short for the structure it has. We don't get enough time to flesh stories out with two-parters, we don't get the extra downtime for the Doctor and Ruby to just enjoy themselves. Everything feels so frantic at a breakneck pace that we can't dwell on the little things that make Doctor Who such a great show. I feel like the series would have worked better if they'd either embraced Flux's approach of one serialized story, or something like Series 9 did with lots of two-parters. 8 episodes is just not enough for Doctor Who, it's never been that kind of show. It needs lots of episodes to truly explore everything and create a sense of a big journey through time and space, but Series 14 unfortunately doesn't get enough time to properly achieve that kind of satisfaction, leaving you always wanting more and not in a good way. I have seen people point out that you get more out of the character dynamics and the episode variety in half series like Series 6 and Series 7 than you do in the entirety of Series 14. And I kind of agree, it's a huge problem. Don't get me wrong, Series 14 looks great. Of course, it's nowhere near the absolute cinematic peak of the Capaldi era, but it still looks phenomenal with a lot of great directing and use of modern technology, like the giant volume wall in Boom. It's a nice looking series, with episodes like 73 Yards really standing out for their look and feel. Just please get rid of those forced letterbox borders, it doesn't make things look more cinematic, and I just really hate it here. Anyway, the show definitely boasts its higher budget with a lot of fantastic vistas, landscapes, and sequences previous eras would have struggled to achieve. But I do think there's a certain flatness to it all. Maybe it's just my nostalgia bias of Series 1 to 10, but I almost feel like Series 14 was shot too realistically. Too much like a grounded TV drama rather than a thrilling sci-fi adventure serial. When I look at Series 4 for example, I see a lot of purple and green colours. When I look at Series 3, the predominant colours are brown and grungy orange. The Smith era for example prioritised a lot of dynamic lighting and shot composition taking advantage of the newly implemented HD production. So the bold colours and contrast really popped and looked amazing. And of course the Capaldi era was just a cinematography dream all around, with absolutely astoundingly beautiful shots and lighting everywhere you looked. Every series from 1 to 10 felt very unique visually, making each picture speak 1,000 words and making you feel something without any dialogue or acting needed. It all just looked so beautiful. I just didn't get that with Series 14 though. The colours felt a lot more muted and flat, even in sequences like the end of Devil's Chord, which is meant to be this big, colourful musical. It worked for something like Dot and Bubble of course, because that flatness helped reinforce the emptiness and fake nature of that society, but everywhere else I just felt like the show didn't look as unique and distinctive as it always should strive to be. There are obviously good visual moments here and there, but the whole look and feel of the series just feels off to me, and I can't quite escape it. You know, just turn contrast and saturation sliders up just a little bit, or maybe exposure. Just change a couple of settings, it shouldn't look so flat. And I think that sense of safety and blandness is really weird considering just how experimental the actual episodes are. And it's almost too experimental to be honest. Throughout the whole series, there's only really 2 episodes I'd consider somewhat safe, run-of-the-mill Doctor Who, and those are Space Babies and Rogue. But then you have episodes like Devil's Chord, which uses a lot of musical influences and straight up ends with a musical number. Boom traps the Doctor on a landmine for the whole episode, and 73 Yards completely removes him from the story so Ruby can have a whole weird adventure where some creepy woman follows her for 80 years until she becomes her or something. It's all very different and pushing the boundaries. Even Dot and Bubble, which I also kind of found to be at least the most like the Doctor Who I'm used to, was a Doctor and companion-like story with experimental storytelling as the protagonist turned out to be a villain. Don't get me wrong, I like when Doctor Who gets experimental. My favourite episodes are Midnight and Heaven Sent, which speak for themselves. However, I think the problem here was that Series 14 tried to reinvent the wheel without showing what the wheel was to begin with. It tried to subvert and turn Doctor Who on its head without ever establishing the status quo. The experimental nature of the series is the kind of thing you'd expect from the second series, after the first had established a sense of normality and familiarity. You know, just introducing all the basics and then building off them. However, because the tone and style of Series 14 changes literally every other episode, you have no idea what the foundation is. You don't know what's normal and what's an experiment, because it never takes the time to show you, and that's a critical error. Especially when it comes to appealing to those new viewers who probably felt tonal whiplash going from farting babies and pantomime villains to claustrophobic thrillers, existential horror, and social media racism. It's a mess, even for Doctor Who's very, very standards. I straight up think the episode order of Series 14 was a mistake. Not just because they opened with 2 of the absolute worst episodes of the series, ones that kind of made it embarrassing to be a Doctor Who fan trying to introduce the show to new people, but also because it creates a huge tonal and threat level mismatch throughout the series. You have those 2 very comedic episodes, then 3 episodes with incredibly heavy subject matter and high concept storytelling, then suddenly you have cosplaying birds before the literal god of death and destruction shows up to kill everything in the universe. us. Even by Doctor Who standards, this running order was a nightmare and probably caused a lot of damage for the flow of things. Rogue should have been earlier in the series and Devil's Cord later, maybe between 73 Yards and Dot and Bubble to break up those episodes a bit. It also doesn't help that the actual narratives of the episodes feel all over the place too, like Ruby being 6 months into her travels by the time episode 2 comes around and then only just stepping foot on an alien planet in episode 3, despite having been in the TARDIS for that long. A lot of key things happen off screen, whether by design or because of the series being extensively cut down with a staggering amount of important scenes being edited out for time or removed in the writing phase. I think as a series, it's fundamentally badly assembled, and it's a bad look when people are theorizing that you moved episodes around for Eurovision or that all the inconsistencies were intentional for some big meta-narrative, when in actuality, it was just poorly planned out on a structural level. This video is already getting pretty long, so I think I'll wrap it up. To conclude, Series 14 was pretty weak, all things considered, especially compared to Series 1 to 10. All series, I think it's weaker than, without much debate. I do believe it's a definite step up from Series 11 to 13, and I'm hoping a lot of the issues were just teething issues, or Davis either being a bit rusty or just overworking himself. So hopefully Series 15 is better, although I think that's doubtful because they filmed it immediately after, and therefore couldn't take into account any issues fans might have. And Ncuti Gatwa and Millie Gibson are by far the standouts of the series, approaching every script with enthusiasm and delivering engaging performances week after week. However, the series really fell below my expectations, especially after having seen Davis make such compelling and endlessly rewatchable Doctor Who all those years ago. With only 8 episodes, it felt way too short and ended just when it felt like it was getting going. The episode order was a jumbled mess with no cohesion, and there was a real lack of memorable monsters and villains or even settings. A lot of the emotion of the series felt really forced to me, like it was begging for an emotional reaction it didn't really earn, so it was hard to engage with and be immersed. Overall, I'd give Series 14 a perfectly middling C grade. It's not irredeemably awful, not even close. It has a lot going for it, but it tried to do too much too soon and fell short more often than not. Even Murray Gold's score felt a little bit like a letdown, with so few standout tracks. I really wanted to love Series 14 as a fresh start and a return to the familiar Doctor Who I fell in love with, but a number of times throughout the series, I couldn't help but wonder if I even love Doctor Who anymore. Whether this is still really the show for me, or whether I should just let it go and remember the good times. And on that depressing note, that's all I've got time for. What did you think of Series 14? Let me know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye. And I'd just like to give an extra special thank you to my Asbantium level patron Fallon Cortez, my Diamond level patron Glenna Clark, my Platinum level patrons Matthew Burns and Maximilian Foreman, and all my Gold level patrons Chris Douglas, Daniel Shillito, the 3 Railway Engines, and Tom Azar. Thank you so much for your support.